The Rhodesian Bush War, also known as the Second Chimurenga or the Zimbabwe War of Liberation, was a civil war that took place from July 1964 to December 1979 in the unrecognized country of Rhodesia. The conflict pitted three forces against one another: the Rhodesian government, under Ian Smith, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, the military wing of Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union, and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army of Joshua Gamo's Zimbabwe African People's Union. The war and its subsequent internal settlement, signed in 1978 by Smith and Muzorewa, led to the implementation in June 1979 of universal suffrage and end of white minority rule in Rhodesia, which was renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia under a black majority government. However, this new order failed to win international recognition and the war continued. Negotiations between the government of Zimbabwe Rhodesia, the British government and Mugabe and Gamo's United Patriotic Front took place at Lancaster House, London in December 1979, and the Lancaster House Agreement was signed. The country returned temporarily to British control and new elections were held under British and Commonwealth supervision in March 1980. ZANU won the election and Mugabe became the first Prime Minister of Zimbabwe on 18 April 1980, when the country achieved internationally recognized independence. Background: the origins of the war in Rhodesia can be traced to the colonization of the region by white settlers in the late 19th century, and the descent of black African nationalist leaders who opposed white minority rule. Rhodesia was settled by British and South African pioneers beginning in the 1890s, and while it was never accorded full dominion status, white Rhodesians effectively governed the country after 1923. In his famous "Wind of Change" speech addressed to the Parliament of South Africa in 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan stated Britain's intention to grant independence to British colonies in Africa under black majority rule. Many white Rhodesians were concerned that decolonization and majority rule would bring chaos, as had resulted in the former Belgian Congo in 1960. Britain's unwillingness to compromise on the policy of no independence before majority rule led to Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence on the 11th of November 1965. Though Rhodesia had the unofficial support of neighboring South Africa and Portugal, which governed Mozambique, it never gained formal recognition from any country. Many white Rhodesians viewed the war as one of survival, with atrocities committed in the former Belgian Congo, the Mau Mau uprising campaign in Kenya and elsewhere in Africa fresh in their minds. Many whites viewed their lifestyle as being under attack, which both had considered safer and with a higher standard of living than many other African countries. Although the vote in Rhodesia was technically open to all, regardless of race, property ownership requirements effectively denied the franchise to most of Rhodesia's blacks. The 1969 constitution provided for non-Europeans to elect representatives for 8 of the seats in the 66-seat parliament. A further 8 seats were reserved for tribal chiefs. Amidst this backdrop, black nationalists advocated armed struggle to bring about independence in Rhodesia under black majority rule. Resistance also stemmed from the wide economic inequality between blacks and whites. In Rhodesia, whites owned most of the fertile land whilst many blacks were crowded on barren land. Following forced evictions or clearances by the colonial authorities, 2 rival nationalist organizations soon emerged: the Zimbabwe African People's Union and the Zimbabwe African National Union, following a split in the former in August 1963. Following disagreements over tactics as well as tribalism and personality clashes, ZANU and its military wing ZANLA were headed initially by the Reverend Ndabanangi Sithole, and later Robert Mugabe, consisted mainly of the Shona-speaking tribes. ZAPU and its military wing ZIPRA consisted mainly of Ndebele ethnic groups under Joshua Nkomo. Cold War politics played into the conflict also, with the Soviet Union supporting ZIPRA and China providing support to ZANLA. Each group subsequently fought a separate war against the Rhodesian security forces, and the two groups sometimes fought against each other as well. In June 1979, the governments of Cuba and Mozambique offered direct military assistance to the Patriotic Front, but Mugabe and Nkomo declined. Other foreign nations also contributed to the conflict. For instance, North Korean military officials taught Zimbabwean militants how to use explosives and arms in a camp near Pyongyang. By April 1979, 12,000 ZANLA guerrillas were training in Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Libya, while 9,500 of its 13,500 extant cadres were operating in Rhodesia. On the other side of the conflict, South Africa clandestinely provided both material and military support to the Rhodesian government. Inevitably, the Bush War occurred within the context of regional Cold War in Africa, and became embroiled with a number of conflicts in several neighboring countries as well. Such conflicts included the Angolan War of Independence and Angolan Civil War, the Mozambican War of Independence and Mozambican Civil War, and the Shaba I and Shaba II conflicts. Perceptions. The conflict was seen by the nationalist groups and the British government of the time as a war of national and racial liberation. The Rhodesian government saw the conflict as a fight between one part of the country's population on behalf of the whole population against several externally financed parties made up of predominantly black radicals and communists. The nationalists saw their country as having been occupied and dominated by a foreign power, namely Britain, since 1890. The British government, in the person of the governor, had indirectly ruled the country from 1923, when it took over from the British South Africa Company and granted self-governing status to a locally elected government, made up predominantly of whites. Ian Smith's Rhodesian Front Party was elected to power in 1962 and unilaterally declared independence on the 11th of November 1965 to preserve what it saw as the self-government it had possessed since 1923. The minority Rhodesian government believed they were defending Western values, Christianity, the rule of law and democracy by fighting communists. However, they were unwilling to compromise on most political, economic and social inequalities. The Smith administration held that the traditional chiefs were the legitimate voice of the black Shona and Ndebele population, not the ZANU and ZAPU nationalists, who it regarded as dangerous, violent usurpers. In 1978–1979 the Smith administration attempted to blunt the power of the nationalist cause by acceding to an internal settlement which ended minority rule, changed the name of the country to Zimbabwe Rhodesia, and arranged multiracial elections, which were held in 1979 and won by Bishop Abel Muzorewa, who became the country's first black head of government. However, unsatisfied with this and spurred on by Britain's refusal to recognize the new order, the nationalist forces persisted. Ultimately the war ended when, at the behest of both South Africa and the United States, the Zimbabwe Rhodesian government ceded power to Britain with the Lancaster House Agreement in December 1979. The British government then held another election in 1980 to form a new government. Britain recognized this new government, headed by Robert Mugabe, and the newly independent and internationally recognized country was renamed Zimbabwe. Belligerents. Rhodesian security forces. Despite the impact of economic and diplomatic sanctions, Rhodesia was able to develop and maintain a potent and professional military capability. In June 1977, Time magazine reported that, man for man, the Rhodesian Army ranks among the world's finest fighting units. The Army was always a relatively small force, consisting of just 3,400 regular troops in 1970. However, by 1978-79 it had grown to some 10,800 regulars nominally supported by about 40,000 reservists, though by the last year of the war, perhaps as few as 15,000 were available for active service. While the regular army consisted of a professional corps drawn from the white population, by 1978-79 the majority of its complement was actually composed of black soldiers. The Army Reserves, in contrast, were largely white and, towards the end of the war, were increasingly being called up to deal with the growing insurgency. The regular army was supported by the paramilitary British South Africa Police with a strength of about 8,000 to 11,000 men and supported by between 19,000 to 35,000 police reservists. The police reserves acted as type of home guard. The war saw the extensive operation of Rhodesian regulars as well as elite units such as the Selous Scouts and the Rhodesian Shash. The Rhodesian army fought bitterly against the black nationalist guerrillas. The Rhodesian army also comprised mostly black regiments such as the Rhodesian African Rifles. As the war went on, the frequent call-up of reservists was increasingly used to supplement the professional soldiers and the many volunteers from overseas. By 1978 all white males up to the age of 60 were subject to periodic call-up into the army. Younger men up to 35 might expect to spend alternating blocks of 6 weeks in the army and at home. Many of the overseas volunteers came from Britain, Ireland, South Africa, Portugal, Hong Kong, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the United States of America, with the latter three being held in high regard for their recent Vietnam War experience. The Rhodesian army was, considering the arms embargo, well equipped. The standard infantry weapon was the Belgian FN FAL rifle as produced in South Africa under license as the R1 rifle and supplemented by the H&K G3 rifle that came from Portuguese forces. However, other weapons such as the British L1A1 variant of the FAL and the older British Lee Enfield bolt-action rifle were used by reservists and the British South Africa Police. Other weapons included the Bren LMG in both 303 and 7.62 mm NATO, Sten SMG, Uzi, Browning high-power pistol, Colt M16 rifle, FN Mag general-purpose machine guns, 81 mm mortar, and Claymore mines. After Rhodesia was heavily reliant on South African and domestically produced weapons and equipment, as well as international smuggling operations, commonly referred to as sanction busting. South Africa provided extensive support to Rhodesia in the form of a lend-lease program in both the official and unofficial support of many branches of the South African Armed Forces. The Rhodesian Air Force operated a variety of equipment and carried out numerous roles, with air power providing the Rhodesians with a significant advantage over their guerrilla enemy. When the arms embargo was introduced, the RHAF was suddenly lacking spare parts from external suppliers for its fleet of mainly British aircraft, and was forced to find alternative means of keeping their aircraft flying. The RHAF operated a fleet of largely obsolete aircraft, such as the World War II vintage Douglas Dakota transport aircraft and the British de Havilland Vampire. The larger South African Air Force provided extensive training, aircraft and aircrews in support of RHAF operations from 1966. The Rhodesians also used more modern types of aircraft like the Hawker Hunter and Canberra bombers, the Cessna Skymaster as well as aerospatial Alouette 3 helicopters until they were supplemented by the Augusta Belt 205. Very late in the war, the Rhodesian forces were able to obtain and use a very few smuggled-in Augusta Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters. At the beginning of the war, much of Rhodesia's military hardware was of British and Commonwealth origin. But during the course of the conflict, new equipment such as Eland armoured cars were procured from the South Africans. Several Polish-made T-55 tanks destined for Idi Amin's regime in Uganda were diverted to Rhodesia by the South Africans. though only in the last year of the war. The Rhodesians also produced a wide range of wheeled mine-proofed armored vehicles, often using Mercedes Unimog, Land Rover and Bedford truck components, including unlicensed copies of the Mercedes-Benz R416. During the course of the war, most white citizens carried personal weapons, and it was not unusual to see white housewives carrying submachine guns. A siege mentality set in, and all civilian transport had to be escorted in convoys for safety against ambushes. Farms and villages in rural areas were frequently attacked by guerrillas. The Rhodesian government divided the country into 8 geographical operational areas: Northwest Border, Eastern Border, Northeast Border, Southeast Border, Midlands, Kariba, Matabeleland, Salisbury and District. Nationalist guerrilla forces. The two major armed groups campaigning against Ian Smith's government were the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Zimbabwe African National Union, and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, the armed wing of the Zimbabwe African People's Union. The fighting was largely rural, with the two rival movements attempting to secure peasant support and to recruit fighters while harassing the administration and the white civilians. To ensure local domination, ZANLA and ZIPRA sometimes fought against each other as well as against the security forces. Unlike the town dwellers, rural whites faced danger and many were killed, but in 1979 there were still 6,000 white farmers. They were vulnerable every time they left the homestead. ZANLA was the armed wing of ZANU. The organization also had strong links with Mozambique's independence movement, FRELIMO. ZANLA, in the end, was present on a more or less permanent basis in over half the country, as evidenced by the location of the demobilization bases at the end of the war, which were in every province except Matabeleland North. In addition, they were fighting a civil war against ZIPRA, despite the formation of a joint front by their political parties after 1978. It was ZANLA's intention to occupy the ground, supplant the administration in rural areas, and then mount the final conventional campaign. ZANLA concentrated on the politicization of the rural areas using force, persuasion, ties of kinship and collaboration with spirit mediums. ZANLA tried to paralyze the Rhodesian effort and economy by planting Soviet anti-tank landmines on the roads. From 1972 to 1980 there were 2,504 vehicle detonations of landmines, killing 632 people, and injuring 4,410. The mining of roads increased as the war intensified. Indeed, the increase from 1978 to 1979 was 233.7%. In response, the Rhodesians cooperated with the South Africans to develop a range of mine-protected vehicles. They began by replacing air in tires with water, which absorbed some of the blast and reduced the heat of the explosion. Initially, they protected the bodies with steel deflector plates, sandbags and mine conveyor belting. Later, purpose-built vehicles with V-shaped blast holes dispersed the blast, and deaths in such vehicles became unusual events. ZIPRA was the anti-government force based around the Ndebele ethnicity, led by Joshua Nkomo, and the ZAPU political organization. In contrast to ZANLA's Mozambique links, Gamo's ZIPRA was more oriented towards Zambia for local bases. However, this was not always with full Zambian government support. By 1979, the combined forces based in Zambia of ZIPRA, Umkhonto and Southwest African SWAPO fighters were a major threat to Zambia's internal security. Because ZAPU's political strategy relied more heavily on negotiations than armed force, ZIPRA did not grow as quickly or elaborately as ZANLA. but by 1979 it had an estimated 20,000 combatants, almost all based in camps around Lusaka, Zambia. ZIPRA was responsible for 2 attacks on civilian Air Rhodesia Viscount aeroplanes, on 3 September 1978 and 12 February 1979. Using SAR-7 surface-to-air missiles, the guerrillas shot down each plane during its ascent as it took off from Kariba Airport. ZIPRA took advice from its Soviet instructors in formulating its version of popular revolution and its strategy for taking over the country. There were about 1,400 Soviets, 700 East German and 500 Cuban instructors deployed to the area. On the advice of the Soviets, ZIPRA built up its conventional forces, and motorized with Soviet armored vehicles and a number of small aeroplanes. In Zambia, ZIPRA's intention was to allow ZANLA to bring the Rhodesian forces to the point of defeat, and then to take the victory from the much lighter forces of ZANLA and the essentially defeated Rhodesians. ZIPRA kept a light presence within Rhodesia, reconnoitering, keeping contact with the peasants and sometimes skirmishing with ZANLA. ZIPRA's conventional threat actually distracted the Rhodesians from fighting ZANLA to an extent. By the late 1970s, ZIPRA had developed a strategy known as storming the heavens to launch a conventional invasion from Zambia, supported by a limited number of armored vehicles and light aircraft. An operation by the Rhodesian Armed Forces to destroy a ZIPRA base near Livingstone in Zambia was never launched. The ZIPRA strategy for taking over Zimbabwe proved unsuccessful. In any event, the transfer of power to black nationalists took place not by the military takeover expected by ZIPRA, but by a peaceful and internationally supervised election. Rhodesia reverted briefly to real British rule, and a general election took place in early 1980. This election was supervised both by the UK and international forces. Robert Mugabe won this election, being the only major competitor for the vote of the majority ethnicity, the Shona. Once in power, Mugabe was internationally recognized as Zimbabwe's leader and was installed as head of government, as well as having the backing of the overwhelming majority ethnic group. He was therefore able to quickly and irreversibly consolidate his power in Zimbabwe, forcing ZAPU, and therefore ZIPRA, which was ZAPU's army, to give up hope of taking over the country in the place of ZANU, ZANLA.